Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode of Root for Change, an initiative by Green Frontier Capital, one of India's leading climate tech focused VCs. I'm Ritika, I'm a venture analyst in the team, and I'm happy to have here with me today Dr. Jai Asundi, who's the executive director of CSTEP, or the Center for the Study of Science, Technology and Policy. I'd let him introduce himself and tell us a bit more about his professional journey.
Good afternoon, good evening, Ritika. It's good to be here and it's good to be speaking to you. Very briefly, I was trained as an engineer originally, and I spent a couple of years also in the information technology industry. After which, I did my PhD in engineering and public policy from Carnegie Mellon University. And post that, after a few years teaching at the University of Texas, I returned back to India to join CSTEP, where I've been working on issues around energy, climate, artificial intelligence, and air quality. We've been working on issues around clean energy transition, working around climate change, sustainability, and also now talking about clean air for all.
Very interesting. Dr. Sindhi, since you've mentioned energy transition and you've been doing a lot of work in energy transition, and it's been the hot topic these days, whenever climate change is discussed, decarbonization is discussed, we also talk about energy transition. So, what are the pathways for India's energy transition? And what kind of roles can states play, considering the health of discoms in India? We all know we all know about the financial health of discoms. So, what kind of role can states play should energy transition be decentralized?
So, just trying to address the broader question first, I think we are all aware that we have to move towards non-fossil fuel-based energy. As we know and we agree that energy is a source of development, India has quite a bit of development needs. There are lots of issues around the Sustainable Development Goals and what we at CSTEP call a decent quality of life that all uh, humans or all residents of India should have. And based on that, we believe that there is a ways to go in terms of our energy transition in the sense that we need more energy, we need to build more capacity, and the new capacity will definitely need to come from fossil fuels. Um, for the purpose of, as we all know, also that majority of energy capacity is done by the state. And when we mean state, I mean by either the central or the state governments. And the central government or the state has already pledged that we will reach about 50% of our capacity by 2030, which tantamounts to somewhere between 450 to 500 gigawatts of capacity that will be added to the grid by 2030 that will be non-fossil fuel-based. Now,
Yes.
energy is a concurrent subject, so the state governments have to also step in and start building this particular capacity. There are certain things like renewable purchase obligations that most of the discoms have with regards, or the state discoms have with regard to renewable energy. And what we are saying is that the renewable rich states like Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Tamil Nadu, and Gujarat and also Rajasthan have already been putting in a lot of effort in terms of adding renewable energy capacity in the state. Uh, what we will need to see is more efforts of this sort from other states. Now, what it also means from a clean energy transition is looking at ways in which renewable energy, or as they now call decentralized renewable energy, can become an important source of energy for people. At the end of it, let us understand the purpose of the energy is not just to produce the energy, but to also have useful uses for the same. Transmission losses should be minimized. And so, hence, production where consumption happens will be the best form of increase in capacity, which will make sure development actually happens in places. On the question about states, I think a very hard look will need to be had with regards to various discoms. Uh, I think there are private discoms that are profitable, so it doesn't mean that the state discoms will not be cannot be made profitable. I think it will require that type of look at some of these enterprises, and hopefully we will get there sooner than later because of the need of the hour.
Absolutely, absolutely agree with you here. So let me change my question a little bit to ask you, what is the role that the private sector can play? How do startups play a role in the, especially the decentralized renewable energy that you talked
So actually, this is one area where in the past, private company or private enterprises used to just serve the government entities and provide the necessary building block. In this case, we are actually seeing far more opportunities for private sectors, for private sector players to play a role. One is, of course, you have the large entities like Tata Power, Renew Power, and others that are actually doing the job of a discom and doing a big role in that regard. So they will obviously start to look at how to integrate more renewable energy into their grid systems. There is also a lot of role to be played by smaller entities that are now starting to look at maybe generating smaller amounts of renewable energy, be it wind, be it solar, and that has already started happening. You have a lot of private players already doing that. You have a lot of capacity that has been taken up by the private players, and they end up selling it to the grid in the process. So that is the second. The third will become in issues related to managing a grid that is more renewable energy heavy. So when we talk about a renewable energy heavy grid, it also means high variability. How do you manage this variability will become a challenge. In the past, we used to always have the rolling blackouts where the grid operator would just say, okay, we cannot service this load, so they will not uh, provide energy, or in cases which have happened in southern India where there's excess power, they will actually tell generators to switch off or disconnect from the grid. So there are both things are there, and these are things that we would not want to have as part of the grid. So I think there's a lot of bit of intelligence, a lot of bit of work that can happen, and again, it can be as a provider to the service. And then, last but not the least, we could see the advent of new companies coming in and providing grid stability services, be it in terms of battery or in terms of providing energy that is mixed from various sources. And these are opportunities that exist at least in the electricity sector. In the energy sector as a whole, there's a lot of innovation that can happen where energy from renewable energy can be used for various industries, the heavy industries like iron and steel, but also in the small, medium MSME industries, which is a rather it's a small but a decent fraction of the energy requirement, and if that can be served through these private providers, it could provide or it could be a very good source of energy for these players and help them on their transition towards a clean energy future.
makes a lot of sense. And just a follow up to the last point that you made about innovation. So, do you see science and technology, innovation in science and technology playing a huge role in India's decarbonization? Just as an example, we recently saw that India now has lithium reserves, and that could potentially play a lot of an important role in India's energy transition. So, how do you see this innovation impacting trajectories for this?
Yeah, so to be honest, what you asking me is asking me why my company exists. The Center for Study of Science, Technology, and Policy rests on the premise that science and technology has a major role to play in our future, in our development future, and it can be done in a way that is equitable and make it more available to all people and more inclusive in that regard. So, from that perspective, yes, science and technology has a very, very important role to play. But what has a more important role to play is not just the pure play of science and technology, but how it applies to society and understanding the implications of how it will be applied in our ecosystem. So, to be very honest with you, we have been working in the area of energy transition since 2008 when we first worked with the discoms and the central government on the IT for Power report that we had written back then, which became APDRP. I think now there's a lot more opportunity for players to come in with new materials when it comes to battery material storage or new algorithms when it comes to figuring out how to balance the grid, how to come up with new mechanisms by which we can incentivize players or people to consume more or consume less at various points in time, and hence follow the curve as opposed to the supply following demand. You have demand following the supply, which is a more natural way to think about it. And also when you talked about the reserves, of course, reserves have just been found. It's going to take a long time for us to develop those reserves, but it also it augurs well for the long term view. If you were to start look at 2050, 2060, then we can say yes, there is an option, there is something available. And I will say that every decade there has been some technological revolution or opportunity that has provided us the way to move forward. Every time when we felt that we were at the dead end, there was something new that came up. And I think that is part of the human spirit to keep innovating and keep coming up with new ideas by which we can find our way out of this problem.
Absolutely. So, since we're talking about long-term trajectories as well, I wanted to touch upon India's net zero commitment. So, we all know that there is a 2070 net zero commitment. Do you think it's ambitious? Do you think it's attainable? And along with that, what are the key levers, basis which this trajectory will change for us?
Yeah, so the thing with long-term trajectories or long-term transitions is that very small changes in the initial period has a very big role to play in the long term, right? So I think any person who studies interest rates or who studies long-term investment portfolios and things like that knows that even a small change, a 0.5% change in interest upfront over the entire period of time can make a massive difference when it comes to uh, this long-term period. As Warren Buffett said, right? It's one of the wonders of the world is compounding. Now, based on that, one thing I can say is that any date that we pick would be a date I'm sure we would have to work towards. It's not something that is going to be a walk in the park that we get there. At the same time, can we do it earlier? I would say yes, we can, provided the conditions are right. I would say always overachieve than underachieve. So in that sense, I think 2070 is seems like a middling target. It is something that we could achieve given the large challenges that exist. So let's look at what are the large challenges that we have. Electricity sector today, capacity of coal is 60%, right? So to go to net zero would mean we would have to replace not only all the renewable, all our new energy has to come from renewable, but we also will have to start replacing all the old energy with renewable energy, and that is going to be a significant challenge. And that is something that I think we are up to. It will require a lot more than just putting solar, wind, and geothermal, all options. I mean, even nuclear and hydro, of course, develop the hydro resources that we already have. But then also figure out better ways to manage the grid, right? In terms of how would we be able to manage the intermittency that will come with it. We have a drought going on right now in the southern states, and so they do not want to let out too much water through the dams, and as a result, your hydro supply is actually reduced. So there are challenges associated with depending on any one source or the other. At the same time, I think there might be new technologies that come in terms of, as we have seen when it came to for LED bulbs, right? That is one one technology that has reduced consumption significantly, right? So if you look at lighting load, it has really reduced consumption significantly. The load of the future will probably be cooling, and I think some innovation around that will be definitely needed, where I think people will need cool spaces to either work or to spend some of their time, especially when there are very hot days, and when thermal comfort becomes an important aspect. I think the other part that we will have to start looking at is the industrial sector, where the hard to abate sectors like cement, iron and steel, and some of the allied sectors we will have to figure out ways in which we can transition to a low carbon future, which is where there's a lot of talk about using hydrogen. I think today hydrogen is still in its, I would say, hype phase, where people are still talking about it for all applications. Over time, we will figure out where the best use of hydrogen is, whether we'll be able to use it for cement, iron, and steel, or use it for things like fertilizers, which seems like a very promising area. But then it can also be used for long haul transport. So there are various options available in that, and that's one another option of transitioning from the traditional fossil fuels to another fuel, hydrogen. Of course, when you liquefy it, you can transport it, things like that. So there are some advantages to hydrogen. Of course, there are also disadvantages to hydrogen. So that said, I think from a long-term energy perspective, we will definitely have to think about all the technologies and think about how we will be able to figure out the transition going forward.
And just taking a broader view on this topic and focusing more on innovation and startups. So we all know that electric mobility, the transition has actually been driven by startups. So how do you see startups playing a role in other sectors and decarbonization in other sectors?
Well, in each of the areas that I talked about, I think startups can play a major role in the innovation cycle, right? So when you look at issues, the first one I talked about is, let's say, electrification of our road transport, which consumes a great amount of fossil fuel energy. That could be one place where startups play a major role, figuring out new battery materials, new ways in which charging, discharging. There are lots of places where efficiency can be gained, and startups can play a major role in that. That is number one. The second place, of course, startups starting to come up with ideas on how to, change processes when it comes to decarbonization of either MSMEs or cement, iron, steel, traditional manufacturing. Again, you have a lot going on there in terms of processing and processing of the lithium ion, or coming up with new battery materials. That could be also another new area for startups. And then, of course, you also have startups that are getting into the efficiency related to, grid stability or even vehicular freight transport. I mean, as I can already see, there are lots of these freight companies that are starting to use electric vehicles to transport goods, and maybe over time it will increase more and more. So these are ways in which our transition can happen and happen more efficiently going forward.
I understand. And I absolutely agree with you here. But what is often not talked about with respect to the net zero commitment is the role of adaptation. So we often talk about mitigation, it's the most talked about subject. But we've seen a lot of financial losses in the country and in other countries, including our neighbors, with respect to climate induced disasters. Most recently, this month itself, where we reported a loss of about 2,400 crores. What is the role that is going that adaptation will play and disaster management, considering that you've also done quite a bit of work on that? If you could talk to us about
Yeah, so so I think one of the things that has happened in the industry is that originally people talked about issues around climate change around two broad areas. One is climate mitigation, climate adaptation. And climate mitigation is the part where we are looking at how do we reduce the amount of CO2 that we put into the atmosphere. Based on the existing calculations, the climate scientists have told us that actually there is only so much amount of carbon space in the atmosphere if we want to limit our temperature to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees centigrade. I mean, there's nothing sacrosanct about these numbers. These are just numbers that we have chosen as scientists, saying that yes, this is how much we should reduce, because we feel that if temperature rises above these values, there could be significant impacts on the ecosystem or the Earth's ecosystem by and large, which is why everyone is saying that. There's no guarantee about that, nor is there a safety. It's not safety either. We could have a bad situation if we get to 2 degrees also. We do not know that. That said, so hence you have these two aspects of climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Adaptation is the part where you say that, well, irrespective of all that we do, there is no way we can stop some amount of global warming, and that is going to lead to certain types of events and certain types of uh, uh, actions. And so hence we need to do something to make sure that we are safe. So what have the Dutch done over the last 100 years in terms of adaptation is that they have built dikes, and they've built various ways in which the water comes in and goes out as far as Netherlands is concerned, and they have figured out a way to manage that. Of course, this happened over a long period of time. One of the biggest concerns that we have with climate, the adaptation that we are talking about now, is that things are going to happen far quicker. We are going to see storm surges when it comes to sea level rise. We're going to see storm surges in coastal cities far quicker and sooner than we can adapt to. And so then the question becomes, how do we adapt to this? And that's where adaptation comes in. As a whole, we like to believe that it's all climate action. So really, it doesn't play as much of a role in our net zero commitments as much as it plays in a role of how do we make sure that we secure our own lives in this interim period as the earth continues to warm and we are continuing to see that, or as we continue to see extreme events increasing, because as we build more infrastructure we are starting to see more losses, because if you didn't have anything there and if something gets washed away, no loss. But if you had a lot of infrastructure in place and it gets washed away, then you actually have a bigger loss. So these are some of the concerns that people who invest in infrastructure have. So I think from that perspective, one of the things that we'll have to do is start taking seriously the possibility that we may not achieve the 1.5 or the 2 degrees, or even if we achieve the 1.5, 2 degrees, what are the likely extreme events that are going to happen? And from that perspective, we at CSTEP have put out uh, an atlas, a map, or a set of documents that says what is going to happen when climate change really comes upon us over the next few decades. And so I think based on that, people who are investing in infrastructure or building infrastructure should pay heed to some of these reports and start to think about what are the likely events that are going to happen. Are they going to be floods in particular areas? Or are they going to be droughts in certain areas, which means populations move away, and so hence the demand for a particular service will go away. So things like that you have to think about. So I think net zero and climate adaptation are two completely different things, but they're all related to the
Yeah,
common idea of climate action.
absolutely. And in your experience, do you think that the models that are being built out are accurately accounting for adaptation challenges and extreme weather events? More specifically, since CSTEP has also built a model of its own called Safari, which is Sustainable Futures for India. If you could tell us a bit more about the trajectories and how adaptation is actually linked in such models.
So, uh, so let me start with the answer first, and then I will elaborate on it. I think from a modeling perspective, I will say that adaptation is a very hard subject because we are looking at uncertainties that are much larger than we are normally used to in terms of knowing what will happen, right? Because nobody has a crystal ball, nobody knows what the answer is going to be. So from that perspective, I think to model extreme events is again extremely hard. It's not so easy to model extreme events because you do not know where it will also strike because these are
Yeah.
extreme events. So that said, I think one of the things that we have been doing at CSTEP is been working with various state governments on taking account of some of these models, right? So what you do is you downscale the global models. You come up with some idea on what's going to happen. You say, oh, precipitation is going to increase in this place, temperature is going to increase in this place. As a result, what we are currently doing is working with state governments to seeing how do they build resilience into their current plans or their current systems so that they become more resilient into the future. The biggest resilience we will need is in the area of agriculture, right? Because at the end of the day, we all need food to eat. And if we do not produce the amount of food that we are producing, we will have serious problems. So what will it mean? It may mean we'll have to start thinking about not only changing the kind of crop that we are growing or moving to a different type of crop rotation, or even starting to think about new types of crops growing in certain areas because it is now possible to do that there. So I think there's a lot of work that is going to go on in the various departments, especially the agriculture departments of the various states, to start thinking about this particular future. That comes in the area of adaptation. The model that we have built is called Sustainable Alternate Futures for India. So Safari is a model that we started to build around the time when we started to notice that most of the existing models were very linear. right? All the models, especially in our mitigation space, we were looking at, everyone was looking at it in a very linear manner and trying to optimize based on that. And we realized that if we are to start thinking about long-term futures, especially when we are looking at 2050, 2060, 2070, uh, the thought experiment we had was, what did we know 10 years ago that we could predict today? And the answer is very little, right? We really didn't expect the mobile revolution to happen, us
Yes.
calling food on our mobile phone so quickly, or making payments without actually having a wallet. I mean, these were all things of the far future. And it has come about in less than 10 years, I would say. I remember 2010 very clearly. And so, from that perspective, how are we so confident that we will be able to say what's going to happen 2035, let alone 2040, 2050? So from that perspective, one of the things that we realized was that we need to build a slightly more uh, dynamic model that takes into account the dynamics, the second order effects, the third order effects of things that are happening. And in that sense, that's one of the things that we did was we started to look at the sustainable alternative futures from a long-term development pathway perspective. And I think what we looked at there in the model was looking at not just the energy sector, which is what most models were doing in the past, and that's what we were also doing before, but we looked at issues around housing, healthcare, education, clean cooking, transport, water, power sector, and the food sector for in terms of its energy use and its need for and its importance in development. Based on that, we've built what we call a systems dynamic model, where you can start feeding in certain development goals. You can choose what your development goals are. You can also choose the various amount of resources you have, or even the constraints that you have, or even the policy levers, and come up with futures over a longer period of time, saying what is going to happen with regards to each of these. You have to understand that even in these systems, even a 5 or a 2% change today over a longer period can mean a huge difference between the uh, expected future and the modeled future into the, and the differences are quite significant. So with that, that is one of the ways in which we have started to think about the future. Modeling, again, coming back to your original question, modeling extreme events is absolutely impossible. It's very difficult to do, but you can start thinking about it from the perspective of scenarios. And that's what Safari also does. You come up with scenarios to saying what if this happens? What is the likelihood of loss? What is the likelihood of the event? And then you can probably use some probabilistic methods to come up with ideas around.
Absolutely. And how is this model being used as of now? Is it being used by the government policymakers?
So as far as policymakers are concerned, what happens is the policymakers reach out to us for specific questions, and we use this model to answer some of those questions when it comes to issues around, let's say, if you want to do blending of ethanol into our fossil fuel mix for transportation, what does it mean? What are the implications of that? Similarly, if you start thinking about long term, how much capacity can we realistically add into the grid going forward, because we do also have land constraints, we have water constraints, we have all of these constraints that we have to start thinking about. And they're not static, right? They're all dynamic constraints. So as a result, these have to be played out in a particular way in the model, and that's what really is happening while we work with various state governments. So let's put it this way: we have been working with various state governments on their state action plans for climate change, and that uses the model. We use some of the model results for that. The current model, Safari, is a national model. We are in the process of building regional models, because regional models will start taking into account water in a slightly more serious manner. So I think that is one of the areas that we are currently developing. And then we are also looking to develop this model to interact with the financial system. That is, where is investment going to come from, and how is it going to impact things like labor? How is it going to impact jobs? How is it going to impact GDP? These are some of the things that we can start looking at in a slightly more systems dynamic perspective, rather than just in a static linear fashion.
I understand. And is this model publicly available for people to
Yes,
actually play around with? Yes,
Yeah, so
please.
there is a website that we've got where people can actually play around with different versions of the model. There's a basic version as well as an advanced version. So it's safari.cstep.in/Safari. If you just go to that website, you should be able to access the Safari results and the tool to some extent to see how things play out over the next 30, 40.
That will actually be very helpful for people trying to understand climate change better and the impact of climate change, because there are still people out there who believe that it's not actually happening. For them to actually see the results being mapped out, even if they are scenarios, would actually help demystify the subject a bit and make it more clear. So, on that topic, how do you see climate change uh, being something that actually everyone can understand and can actually absorb, because at the end of the day everyone is going to be impacted by it. So where to what level is the information flowing right now, and how do we make it?
Yeah, that's actually that is the harder question than all this complex science that we do. Uh, I think human beings at a large level, we experience weather.
Yeah.
We don't experience climate. The climate is only experienced by people who have been living long and thinking about it for a long period of time. But by and large, we only say, oh, it's hot today, oh, it's muggy today, oh, it's
Yeah.
rainy today, things like that. So I think the important thing is we will need to think about narratives. We'll have to think about storytelling because that's what people respond to. I can see how very recently we've started a new initiative called Earth, EARTH, and the idea is how do we get artists to start thinking about climate and thinking about how climate can be communicated to the larger public through art. And for that purpose, we are going to be putting out a fellowship program where young artists can come join us, and we will give them a scholarship so that they can work on specific subjects related to art and try to figure out better ways in which the scientists and the lay public or the general public can communicate with each other better so that they understand what exactly we are talking about. And we also understand their concerns. I think it is important for us as scientists to also understand their concerns and address it in a manner that is, logical for all of us. So that said, I think we are uh, on our way on that regard. The second is, I think we as climate, as engineers, technologists, climate scientists, should also think about better ways in which we can communicate some of our ideas in a more easy manner. And I think that is some work in progress on our side too. We are spending quite amount of effort on that. Hopefully, we will be able to reach out to children in schools. We will also be able to reach out to students in colleges, and then also the working professional. I think we are starting to put out some courses that the working professional can also get aware of what is going on and starting to understand what will it mean for him or her into the future.
It's interesting that you talk about an engineer's perspective on climate. So actually, my next question to you was going to be, do you see any conflict between the technical policy recommendations that you give from an engineering and science perspective versus what is actually implemented? Because realistically, maybe some of the recommendations are not possible or are not accepted. So do you see a discrepancy there, and how do you try to resolve?
Yeah, I've heard this trope all my life, at least in the policy world, is that, oh, we put out this report and it was never considered.
Yes.
And I have come to think quite contrary to the perspective. I feel that especially in this world, if you do not produce a report that is sound and take into account all the perspectives, that means it is rigorous and it's also replicable. That is, what I have built in my backyard is something that others can also apply. If I cannot do that, then I have not done a good study. And so for me, those are those three things. And then the third thing, of course, is that it also has to be robust. The solutions that I provide should not be this corner solution where if you are only standing on one leg and facing the west and this and that, will this work? I don't think that is robust. You need to have solutions where you will say that if people say that, no, I don't want to build it here, but I want to build it 5 miles down the road or build it in some other place, the solution should still work by and large. Now, you may not get the best. And I think that is something that we should start to move away from, is this idea of optimal, because optimal for you may not be optimal for somebody else. So I think we need to move into what we call robust solutions. Come up with a solution that is rigorous. Rigorous meaning you take into account every perspective, including the government policymakers' perspective, so that once they see that perspective has been taken into account, then they are more likely to implement it. Second is make sure that it is replicable. That is, it's not some solution that you built in your backyard, in your research R&D lab, but then cannot be replicable elsewhere. That is number two. And the third one is the idea of robustness. That is, it should be robust to small changes or small nudges from the ecosystem that will say, well, it's not going to be exactly like this. It's going to be a slightly different, and it should be robust to that. So I think the idea is coming up as an engineer, I like to come up with solutions that are all the three. It has to be rigorous, it has to be replicable, and it has to be robust.
Absolutely. And in a country like India, where there's different geography, demography, topography, you have to have solutions that are actually implementable in all possible scenarios. We've got the entire world's geography covered in India by itself. So anything that can be implemented in one state may not be implementable. So I completely agree that policy recommendations need to become more flexible. So, since we're at the tail end and we're unfortunately running out of time, maybe we can talk about the private sector a bit more and how do we synergize policy recommendations and public policy in general with the private sector? At what level should the dialogue be happening, which is at least at the moment not happening as much as it should?
Yeah, I think India, with its traditional social structure and the way things have been progressing, we have been a largely social society, and we've been where the state has been taking the role of the private sector by and large. Post 1991, of course, we are starting to see liberalization, more private sector playing a role. And I would say many people would say that now that the private sector has been taking a far more important role in our day-to-day life than the government. I think the biggest employer still, of course, is the Indian Railways. But if you start looking at it, otherwise, you still have the private sector, including the small, medium industry, that employs a large swath of people and will continue to employ a large number of people. With that said, I think there is a balance, and I think Rohini Nilekani says it very well in a book called Samaj Sarkar Bazaar. And the idea is that how do we create this balance between bazaar, which is the market, and the corporate sector, with the government, which is Sarkar. But then at the end of the day, the purpose of these two is to make sure that Samaj, that is the society, is taken care of. What do we want? What do we want as people? And I think if we start to address some of those fundamental needs, we might be able to address some of these things better. For example, we all want a house over our heads. All of us want clean drinking water. All of us want clean air. These are some of the things that we will say are irrefutable or irrevocable rights that we would like to have as citizens. And I think the citizens, along with the government and the private industry, should figure out how we get to some of those irrevocable rights. Then there is this notion of a decent quality of life, right? That is, we want livelihoods. We want ways in which people can thrive and continue to exist as people, and be culturally active. So some of those aspects also need to be taken care of. So this brings us to the question of, okay, how will private sector play a role? I think if the private sector starts to think about it from that long-term view, think about it as being around for the next 50 to 100 years, rather than just thinking about the quarterly profits in the next quarter, then we might start to think about it strategically, and we'll start thinking about businesses that could be more sustainable, ways in which we could become more sustainable going into the future, so that we then transition from the current way of working to slightly sustainable way of working. Instead of buying 10 pairs of jeans, we buy one pair of jeans. And then, yes, we pay a lot more for it, but then we also use it for a much longer period of time. So I think these are some of the mind shift changes that we will need across the board. So I think to expect only private sector to change is unreasonable. We will also need society to change by and large. And I think various efforts are needed for that.
I completely agree with you. In fact, I could not agree with you more since Green Frontier Capital is a climate focused VC. One of the key aspects that we notice is a shift in consumer practices that actually enable these businesses to grow profitably. And that's why we say that climate based companies, climate focused companies are actually the best investments because this is where the shift is going to be. So, just maybe one concluding remark from your side on a more personal note is who are your role models, Dr. Sindhi? Because I'm sure you've been a role model for many people who've worked with you and who've seen your work. But who are some of the people that you look at?
Well, very hard question because I wouldn't want to single out any single person or even highlight some people over others because different people play different uh,
Yes.
role models in our lives. Uh, I will say in the early through my PhD years and a little beyond, I think my role model was our former chairman, Dr. V.S. Arunachalam, who used to work as the scientific advisor to the Raksha Mantri, and it was his idea that founded CSTEP. And I think he played a major role in or shaping my thinking about science and technology and its impact on society. He was a physicist by training, became a material scientist, and then he did a lot of work in engineering and technology. And one thing I really admired about him was the fact that every few years he would reinvent himself by learning something new and coming up with new ideas in the new discipline. So he went from being in physics to all the way to information technology, which is a large swath of things. That said, he also was very good at personal relations, knowing how to encourage people, how to get them to get the best out of each of them. And I think that was a very big aspect there. In terms of some of the work related to technology and policy, I think the head of department at the Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon, former head, Professor Granger Morgan, who's still there, he actually played a major role in also our shaping our thinking when it comes to technology and public policy and how to think about some of these thoughts and ideas. And I feel there was some way in which he taught the subject and the way he put everything forward and framed everything helped our thinking when it comes to technology policy and making it policy focused research rather than just policy analysis, which are two completely different things. So from that perspective, I'll just leave it there with these two shout outs to two different people who have shaped my thinking in these years.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Sindhi, for joining us today. I'm sure your insights will be extremely valuable to our audience. And we look forward to speaking with you soon on all of the different things. And we will make sure to try out the model ourselves and see what the trajectories for India is. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Ritika, and thank you, GFC, for this opportunity. I think more people should get involved, more people should follow us and look at the work that we are putting out and hopefully engage with us. We are not a organization that is just putting out things for the sake of putting out. We want to engage with our readers and we would want to engage with them with regards to some of the work we are doing and maybe improve on it as we are going. After all, it's not a one-way street, it's a two-way street where we want to get feedback and improve the quality of discourse in our daily lives.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you.